Shri Gurubhyo Namah. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namah. Pranamam to all blessed souls. In the last session, we have seen how Mantra 8 of Isavasyopanishad has been interpreted by Acharyas like Sri Shankara Bhagavatpada and Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. We should also remember that there are Acharyas who have interpreted this to say that all the descriptions given in Mantra 8 like Avranam, Akayam, Avranam, Shuddham, Shukram and so on, and also Kavi, Manishi, all these descriptions have been given to describe the state of a person who has realized Brahman. Brahmavit Brahmaiva Bhavati. A person who has realized truth becomes truth. A person who has realized Brahman becomes Brahman. So these descriptions are actually meant for a person who has realized, for a realized soul. That is a variation of the interpretation that we have seen in the last session. Mantra 9 to 14. They form a special group in this Upanishad. 9 to 14, 6 mantras. And deciphering these mantras has been considered to be most difficult by many acharyas. Many acharyas feel that these 6 mantras make the Upanishad so difficult that Isavasyopanishad has been taken as the most incomprehensible among the Upanishads. This is so because the interpretation given to ordinary words that we are familiar with, like avidya and vidya, sambhudi and asambhudi, the meaning that can be assigned to these words are different from, the meaning is different from what we generally assign to these words. Among these 6 mantras, again we can have a division of a set of 3 mantras from 9 to 12 revolving around the idea of avidya and vidya, and then 9 to 11, and then from 12 to 14 another 3 mantras revolving around the idea of sambhudi and asambhudi. Except for focusing on these 2 sets of ideas, there is a great similarity between what is said in the mantras from 9 to 11 and from 12 to 14. Let us see mantra 9. Antham tama pravishanti ye vidyamupasate tato bhuya ivate tamo ya vidyayang rada. Antham tama pravishanti ye avidyamupasate. Antham tama pravishanti ye avidyamupasate tato bhuya ivate tamo ya vidyaya rada. In the first line, avidya has been stressed. In the second line, vidya has been stressed. Antham tama pravishanti ye avidyam upasade. Those people who worship avidya, they enter pitch darkness. And tato bhuya ivate tamo ya u vidyayang rada. Those people who revel in vidya, who worship vidya, they enter greater darkness. It's very difficult to understand the sense of the mantra if we take avidya merely as ignorance and vidya merely as knowledge. Sri Shankara Bhagavatpada said that here avidya has to be taken as action born of ignorance. People who resort to action, fully desiring the fruits for themselves and looking for very ordinary results, not for Atma-jnana, spiritual knowledge or anything, bhakti, spiritual knowledge or anything, but merely to achieve their mundane wishes. Those people who act out of ignorance, they enter great darkness. They move from darkness to darkness. We have already seen that in Mantra 3. Here avidya, more than ignorance, it means action born of ignorance, selfish, motivated, actions born of ignorance. Such people who indulge in such actions enter darkness. And people who revel in vidya, knowledge, they enter greater darkness. Here, naturally, going by reason, vidya cannot be Atma-jnana, it cannot be spiritual knowledge. Spiritual knowledge liberates. So what is the kind of knowledge that takes us to greater darkness than the darkness into which people who resort to action born of ignorance enter? That can only be knowledge of the devatas who are worshipped through yajnas and yagas. And here Sri Shankara Bhagavatpada says that since there is a need to conjoin this vidya and avidya, that is actually indicated in the coming stanzas. We have already mentioned that 9 to 11 is a unit by itself in this mantra. Mantras from 9 to 11 that form a unit by itself. In mantra 11, the need to conjoin these two, avidya and vidya, that has been specially stressed. It has been instructed. We have been instructed to do so by the Rishi. That being the case, avidya and vidya should be having such a meaning that it should be possible to join them. Otherwise, vidya is the opposite of avidya and it will be very difficult to make an accord between them. So, Sri Shankara Bhagavatpada says that avidya here means action born of ignorance and vidya is the knowledge of the devatas, devata vishayagat jnanam, without action. A person who knows everything about the deeds, actions to be done in the course of a yaga, everything about the devatas who are to be worshipped, but still he would only be reveling in the knowledge of that, never resorting to the karma. There is a great need to conjoin them. So, the meaning can only be, avidya can only mean action born of ignorance, and vidya can only mean the knowledge of the devatas. Perhaps Sri Shankara Bhagavat-pada lived at a time when the atmosphere was sufficiently vitiated by yagas and karmas, where even animals had been sacrificed. Living things, animals, had been sacrificed. Instead of sacrificing selfishness, greed, anger, lust, instead of all that, through the yajnas, people, misguided people, were made to resort to sacrifices where the animals, living animals, had been killed. There was a great need to clear the atmosphere of this bad practice. We have already seen, we know that Sri Buddha came at a point of time when the atmosphere was totally vitiated. So much so that Sri Buddha denounced the practice of sacrificing animals in yagas to the extent of being called a person who was actually against the Vedic principles. Even at the cost of his own image, he had tried to clear the atmosphere of this bad practice. And probably Sanatana Dharma had taken a big beating because of this misguided practice. And Sri Shankara Bhagavat-pada so was all the time aware of what had been happening because of such bad, misguided practices. And probably that was the reason why Sri Shankara Bhagavat-pada had given this kind of an interpretation. One, the social atmosphere of the land at the time when Bhagavat-pada lived. Secondly, the need to conjoin these two ideas in accordance with the advice given by the Rishi in Mantra 11, and because of the contradictory nature of Vidya and Avidya in the normal sense. So naturally, the ordinary meaning cannot be given to that. With all this in mind, probably Shankara Bhagavat-pada had given this kind of an interpretation with all this in mind. The interpretation given by certain other acharyas we have to see, and they, particularly because they lived at a time when the social atmosphere was different, the religious atmosphere was different, the compulsions of doing and yaga and yajna was totally different, and so it would be worthwhile to see the interpretations given by certain other acharyas also. Let us do that in the next session. Hari Om. Pranamam to all blessed souls.